Liberal Fox News commentator Jessica Tarlov dropped a couple of devastating truth bombs on her four MAGA co-hosts and, by extension, Donald Trump himself by number one, defending some of the recent successes of the Biden administration, and number two, exposing some of the disastrous consequences of Donald Trump's disastrous policies if he follows through on his promises. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we have several clips to talk about in this video. As you know, Jessica Tarlov of Fox News is somebody that I greatly admire, greatly respect. Fox News host. But she has the toughest job in mainstream media because she is the lone liberal/progressive voice of dissent on the five. She's outnumbered 4-1 by openly MAGA co-hosts who will often needle and heckle and interrupt and gang up on her. She has to deal with the cherry-picked stories that they deal with, which are almost always anti-Democrat, pro-Republican, pro-Trump. And despite that, she kicks ass. She's smart. She is well prepared. She vigorously defends her position. And despite the hostility of that environment, she succeeds. She thrives. She also, by the way, has a podcast with Professor Scott Galloway called The Raging Moderates. You should definitely check it out if you're in the need for a really informative podcast. She's great. Now, with that in mind, we're in this lame duck period. The Biden administration is coming to an end. We are about to face the creases and auspices and dangers, the authoritarian dangers of a second Trump administration. And yet, even in this situation, there have been some low-key successes under the Biden administration in this lame duck period that Jessica defends, even, of course, as her MAGA co-hosts want to pretend that the whole thing was a failure.
Just in the past few weeks, we've seen his 235th judge confirmed. So now he's surpassed President Trump's record in terms of that. We're going to have averaged out to 3% GDP growth. It's pretty hot. The stock market is so hot that soon-to-be President Trump, round two, wants to take credit for it. Holiday sales up 3.8%. I mean, there are indicators of a very strong and healthy economy and of a lot of success for President Biden. And I think that in a couple of years, once he is out of the spotlight from all of this and people have not forgotten necessarily that Kamala Harris lost, but have moved on from a lot of the material that was in that Wall Street Journal piece, which was certainly explosive, that they will look differently upon him.
But Joe, I don't think you could make the argument that the holiday spending is up and the economy is doing well because Trump won a month ago.
Like, guys,
a month and a half
you
ago.
didn't get magic money
people are feeling like they're safe now, that they have someone coming in who's going to give them more opportunity.
So Jimmy
So this is what's ridiculous about this. A couple of things. I mean, again, Tarlov is great on this, so let's talk about that for a minute. So the judges are important. You have to remember that in the Trump administration, round one, the mission of Trump and Mitch McConnell in particular, what made their unholy alliance so successful, at least initially, was that it was their joint mission, particularly McConnell's, to reshape the federal judiciary and give it a young conservative bent. I don't want to understate how much damage they did because they were very successful. I mean, particularly with what they did to the Supreme Court, which unfortunately President Biden was not in a position to redress because he only got one Supreme Court appointee and Trump got three, thanks to the bad faith scheming of MAGA Republicans and Mitch McConnell. But let's think about this. She's right that the Biden administration and Senate Democrats were actually able, when it came to the non-Supreme Court parts of the judiciary, they were able to beat Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump at their own game in the sense that they were actually able to appoint more judges to the U.S. judiciary than Mitch McConnell. So imagine what Chuck Schumer and President Biden can say. They can say to Mitch McConnell, hey, your life's mission to reshape the federal judiciary, given the same amount of time, we actually made more progress reshaping the federal judiciary or preserving the judiciary, depending on your perspective, than you did. They actually beat McConnell and Trump at their own game. Now, with the Supreme Court, that's a different story, but there aren't, X number of vacancies on the Supreme Court. There are only, by federal statute, 9 positions. And those judges are there, those justices are there until they retire or die. And due to sheer dumb cosmic luck and misfortune on our part, Donald Trump was able to get 3 Supreme Court justices. Also, due in large part to bad faith, Senate scheming. The Republicans say that they would never appoint a Supreme Court justice during an election year because that's just not what you do. You want the American people to weigh in. Well, that's what they told President Obama. But then when it came to Donald Trump, they broke their own damn rule in order to give him another Supreme Court justice. So they're bad faith liars. But 235 judges is excellent. And much of that, or a lot of that, was done despite even thinner margins in the Senate than Trump had to deal with, to wild cards in the form of Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, who would occasionally vote against them in this lame duck period. That's a hell of an accomplishment. And then also with regards to the economy, and we're going to talk about this, a little later in just a second, I suppose, but you see how, I think it's Katie Pavlik, it actually is Donald Trump's, it is the reason that Donald Trump, the economy is doing well because of Donald Trump. Would they ever have said something similar about a Democrat? You see how it always works? We've talked about that. Their economic sentiment is anything good that happens is because of Republicans, even if they're out of power. If Republicans are in power, everything that's good that happens is because of Republicans. If Republicans are in power and something bad happens, it has nothing to do with Republicans. It's probably Democrats or wokeism or something. And then when Republicans are out of power and it's Democrats who are in the White House, anything good that happens is still because of Republicans. Anything bad that happens is because of the Democrats in power. They have this flow chart that's mapped out. It's irrational. Even Jessica Tarlov says, well, you don't magically have more money as a consequence of Donald Trump winning an election and not being inaugurated yet. But they can't help themselves. The bad faith is incredibly potent. Donald Trump has been trying to take credit for President Biden's economy. But what about when the stock market dipped? That happened a couple of times. What about that? No, that's because of Democrats. Ah, gotcha. And you can just see the frustration on Tarlov's face. Like, all they have is one bad faith talking point after another. They can't engage with a single standard for both parties, for both candidates, and they can't do it in good faith. And by the way, again, they would never, ever, ever make such a consideration if the shoe were on the other foot. But before we get back to President Biden's economy and his record, I want to play another clip from Jessica Tarlov about the potential consequences of Donald Trump's economic policy were he to follow through on his disastrous promises.
Countries. Looking at the reactions from the Panamanian government, from the Danes, it doesn't seem like they are interested in playing ball with him right now. Now, it is early. He's not even president again. But the Republicans who have to go on TV and defend this, and not you guys who can translate it, I'm talking about like Congressman Zinke was on, earlier, and he's talking about, this is a serious fellow, right? He was Interior Secretary. He's like, the 4D chess or whatever, and, he's a master negotiator or whatever. These are things that they don't necessarily want to talk about. They have deliverables that they want to bring back for the people who sent them there. I mean, Donald Trump ran as a non-interventionist. If all of this goes through, it sounds pretty interventionist.
Jessica, are you for or against Manifest Destiny, Greenland, and Panama, and maybe Canada? That's really the question.
I am not. Listen, I guess the southern border isn't as big of a problem. We also learned that. It's the northern border that's the problem. But no, I'm not. I think
he's going to fix the southern border.
I think it's already fixed, right? We got the cheap auction items. I just don't think that it helps anyone to insult Justin Trudeau to this level. You can say you need to work.
He flew right down there, had a meeting. Well,
he also wants to win his reelection. But there are a lot of people that we deeply care about to our north. We get a ton from them. I mean, our construction industry would completely fall apart if we had the 25% tariffs and closing the border with Canada. And it's just not a serious.
I don't know. The Danes are sneaky, and they tried to sell us on this offshore wind that is ridiculous.
Now the Danes are sneaky.
So I don't blame him.
But they have
I'm glad he's pushing back. All right.
Because I have said, we have to read between the lines here. I'll never forget
Looking at the reactions from the
she's pointing out the potential consequences of Donald Trump following through on his threats to try to absorb Canada or buy Greenland or absorb Greenland if Greenland can't be bought. Potentially militarily seizing control of the Panama Canal. But as ridiculous as all those things are, and by the way, if a Democrat did anything like this, Fox propagandists would be rightly up in arms, but because it's Trump, he's held to a different standard. She also grounds it in stated policy prescriptions that he's talked about both on the campaign trail and also using specific numbers since he won the election. Like a 25% tariff on all imported goods from two of our top three biggest trading partners, Canada and Mexico. And she's right. There are multiple industries which would collapse as a consequence of that unnecessary and costly trade war, because it would be the American consumers who ultimately pay the difference. It wouldn't be Canada. It wouldn't be Mexico. And it wouldn't be the corporations and businesses who pay the tariff to import those goods. They would absolutely be incentivized to pass those punitive tariffs off in the form of increased prices to the consumer. But you saw Katie Pavlik, the other Fox host, they don't care. Just kind of smile. Now, maybe it's because they don't think Trump will do that, in which case Trump's a liar. Or maybe it's because they're all rich and they're like, who gives a damn? We're in a completely different industry. The media won't collapse. Fox News won't collapse as a consequence of this. And maybe if they have to, add on to the building or do any sort of construction, maybe they're going to pay a pretty penny, but they also had to pay nearly $1 billion in that defamation settlement with Dominion Voting Systems when they knowingly spread Donald Trump's big lie. So they're flush with cash. Maybe that's a concern for other people. But it just goes to the profound lack of seriousness and thoughtfulness that is animating this MAGA movement, and they just demonstrate it on live TV. To get back to the first clip, however, in which Jessica Tarlov is defending the Biden economy and the Biden successes, I do want to talk about this. Bloomberg posted this opinion column, which I like. This was on the 16th, so it was about 11 days ago. And it says, history will be kinder to Joe Biden, the pollsters. Now, basically what Jessica Tarlov said, give it a few years, people may look back with fondness. Maybe. But certainly what happened with Trump. Trump's approval rating when he left office was also like in the 30s. But given time and the rose-tinted glasses, you'd look at the polls now and, anywhere from 40 to more than 50% look back on the first Trump administration with fondness, which I think is insane. But it just goes to show the power of even just some distance between a thing and the American people. So here's what this op-ed has to say. Now the pollsters are declaring President Biden a failure, historians will reckon with too many economic signals rendering the prevailing narrative little more than media noise. From the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 that ushered in the longest period of unemployment before 4% since the 1960s, to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021 that paved the way for road and bridge building, from the Chips and Science Act of 2022 that sparked the biggest manufacturing construction boom the country has ever seen, to 2022's Inflation Reduction Act that has led to many tens of billions of dollars in investment in new technologies that are already leading to new sources of climate-friendly energy, history will show that the 46th president laid the groundwork for U.S. exceptionalism lasting many years, perhaps even decades, after his administration long ended. Under Biden, spending to build manufacturing facilities in the U.S. has risen more than threefold since 2020. This is why the U.S. economy is growing faster than any developed country as measured by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. It's why America has been able to avoid a recession that so many pundits said would be inevitable by now. It's why the U.S. stock market is the envy of the world, soaring 58% under Biden's watch, compared with just 2.5% for everyone else as measured by the MSCI indices. Were he still around, economist John Maynard Keynes would surely have called the performance of equities a psychological referendum on Biden's policies. Breaking away, U.S. equities have greatly outperformed their world counterparts under Biden. You see us here in the blue. No U.S. president in the last half century comes close to replicating Biden's superior score among most of the 15 measures of relative prosperity weighted equally, according to data compiled by Bloomberg. The 2.98% annual increase in non-farm payrolls, 7.9% nominal rate of annualized GDP growth, 14.1% increase in homeowners' equity, 5.1% surge in average hourly earnings, and the hour's 19% appreciation against a basket of major currencies are just some of the metrics that make Biden the uncontested economic leader. Biden ranks number one among U.S. presidents going back to Jimmy Carter based on 15 equally weighted economic and financial measures. So number one in manufacturing jobs, number one in surplus deficit as a share of GDP, number one in household debt to disposable income, number one in bond market performance relative to the world, number two in gross domestic product, number two in non-farm payrolls, number two in home equity, number two in hourly earnings, two in U.S. dollar performance, number four in personal income, number four in auto sales, number four in U.S. stock market performance, number four in stock market performance relative to the world, number five in industrial production, and number 8 in U.S. bond market performance. That's pretty damn good. Now, we're able to geek out on this stuff. I'm not discounting for a second the tabletop, kitchen table pain that so many Americans experience. There's no doubt that many people experience that. But these are the same macroeconomic metrics that we have always used to evaluate from a clinical perspective the success of a president. Biden dropped out of the election. His successor, Vice President Harris, lost the election. So there's no question that there was a dissonance between macroeconomic metrics and what people felt, what people said they felt. But we're talking about with the benefit of years. What will people be able to look back on with this president? And will Trump try to take credit for all of this? Yes, 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 yes. What makes this performance all the more remarkable is that Biden inherited a once-in-the-century COVID-19 pandemic that led to a catastrophic 1.12 million deaths in the U.S. alone from his predecessor, Donald Trump. Remember that at the time of the 2020 election, a recovery from both the pandemic and the worst recession since the Great Depression, presided over by Trump, was still in doubt. Biden then delivered what had largely been missing for the previous 2 decades: fiscal stimulus. Quote, if you look at the economy before the pandemic, it was very low growth for 20 years. JP Morgan Chairman and Chief Executive Officer Jamie Dimon told the Economic Club of New York in April. But if you look at the economy since then, it's been booming. It was the first time in his career as CEO of the #1 bank that Dimon used the word booming to describe the U.S. But the American consumer, even if we go into a recession, is much wealthier than before. Debt service ratios are very low. Their home prices are up. Their stock prices are up. Dimon should know because JP Morgan is one of 16 based U.S. companies that make up the 20 most valuable in the world by stock market value, with most of their superior valuations occurring during the past 3 years. According to data compiled by Bloomberg, investors are gladly paying a record 28% average premium to own American stocks, more than twice what they paid under Trump. Paying a premium. Price-to-earnings ratios for U.S. stocks are much wider under Biden relative to the rest of the world than they were under Trump. Contrary to popular opinion, the Biden economy benefited a wider swath of Americans. The poverty rate fell to 11.1%, the second lowest in data going back to 1973, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. Also, the Gini index of income inequality declined for 2 straight years, the first time that's happened since the early 1970s. Under Biden, household net worth has surged by an unprecedented $32.1 trillion through mid-2024. Americans are spending less than 10% of their income servicing debt, a record low in data going back to 1980 and excluding the pandemic years of 2020 and 2021, when many payments were put on hold. Under Biden, a widely followed measure of income inequality shrank for 2 consecutive years for the first time. The problem for Biden and Vice President Harris was that all of these accomplishments were overshadowed by the sudden scourge of inflation, due mostly, according to researchers at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco and elsewhere, to the pandemic-era disruption to the global supply chain under Trump and a housing market that effectively trapped millions of Americans in place. Inflation is the more complicated story because although the rate of increase of the cost of goods and services has been tamed, as seen in the collapse in the consumer price index from 9.1 in mid-2022 to the recent 2.7, which is where it was under Trump, overall prices are higher. While wages have been rising higher than inflation since mid-2023, helping to explain why consumer spending has exceeded forecasts, it's clear that the 2 years prior, when earning growth lagged behind inflation, still weighs on the minds of voters. Never mind that inflation rates in the U.S. have come down much faster and farther than just about anywhere else in the developed world. It's also clear that Americans feel like the housing market is somehow broken despite the rising home prices referenced by Dimon and big gains in homeowners' equity. The problem here is that in order to help get inflation under control, the Federal Reserve raised its benchmark interest rate from near zero in early 2022 to as high as 5.5% last year. This led to a rise in 30-year mortgages from 3.25% to more than 7%. Existing home sales fell to levels last seen during the financial crisis as housing affordability measured by the National Association of Realtors collapsed. In effect, those who wanted to buy a home largely can't, and those who already own a home don't want to sell and give up their low mortgage rates. There's a light at the end of the housing tunnel. With inflation subsiding, the Fed has started to lower its target for the federal funds rate, and the cost of financing a home is starting to drop as well. The Mortgage Bankers Association index tracking loan applications to purchase a home just posted its biggest 2-week increase since January 2023. Unfortunately for Biden and Harris, little of this context was shared with readers, listeners, or viewers by corporate or social media. On the contrary, many disingenuous media overwhelmed the favorable outlook with misinformation that continues unabated from domestic and foreign perpetrators. It may not have mattered anyway. In many ways, Biden and Harris are victims of circumstance. Incumbents around the world are being ousted in election by voters still scarred by the pandemic and looking to assign blame. Like Biden, Harry Truman and Lyndon Johnson were former vice presidents who also shared much greater disapproval than approval from voters during their waning days in the White House. Only much later did Truman and Johnson garner a much greater appreciation for their handling of the economy. It's likely to be the same with Biden. So I wanted to read that to you because I felt that it was really, really important to emphasize that Biden was just a successful president. The facts are the facts. Polls measure perception, and certainly feelings matter more than facts do in politics, whether we like it or not. Ben Shapiro had it wrong. Facts don't care about your feelings. Well, feelings are what drive politics. And you can have all the most favorable facts in the world, but if you don't parlay those successfully into favorable feelings, you'll lose politics. Now, we can look back on this and say that the Democratic Party and their surrogates, myself included, did not do the best job of persuasively conveying these facts to a sufficient number of people. There's no doubt that we had failures. There's also a question of whether or not that was even possible in this global anti-incumbency surge. I don't know. I think it was probably a combination thereof. But for those who are frustrated, myself included, about the successes of this administration on the domestic front, the upshot is that there may be greater appreciation for that in the future. But where the lingering frustration is that matters to me only in as much as it relates to political victory and translates to political victory. And I don't know to what extent that Democrats will be able to, again, persuasively, like, I don't know if in 4 years, Democrats will be able to defend the accomplishments of the Biden administration. And we don't have time to read this article, but I will say there is a persuasive case to be made that progressives should defend President Biden's legacy in order to protect their future. And I think that there's merit to that, because Biden was the least neoliberal president in modern American history. And that's not to say that you should cultishly devote yourself to Biden or the Biden administration the way the MAGA does with Trump. That would be wrong. But you should defend it on the merits, because my fear is if you don't, then it will further incentivize future Democratic politicians to retreat to their impulsive neoliberal habits rather than make bold progressive change. You actually have to defend some of the progress that's been made and do it boldly, in my opinion. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.